My name is Cole Lindell, and this is my presentation for HCDE 313, Introduction to User Research. Over the course of the quarter, we've been studying different user research methodologies, and more importantly, how to conduct research that will produce good design recommendations and remain respectful of its participants. For my research, I wanted a topic that was not only something that I saw as a real-world problem, but also something that was meaningful to me. For this reason, I chose to research voter engagement within the youth demographic, which is defined by the U.S. Census Bureau as between the ages of 18 and 25. The first step in my research was field study. I was fortunate enough to gain access to the campaign offices of the Washington Women for Hillary. Here, I was able to do some contextual inquiry with some of the campaign leaders. I asked them questions about how they were reaching out to the youth vote, and I watched as they worked in various social media platforms, asking questions along the way about each platform. The next step in my field research was to employ the strategy of deep hanging out, a term coined by the anthropologist Clifford Geertz, and is intended to be a method of immersing oneself deeply into culture. The intention behind this step of my research was to become a user in the system and to deeply understand any trials and frustrations that a young voter might have while trying to participate in the system. I attended the Washington State Caucus for Precinct 4317. It was important during this stage of my research to notice everything around me. I carried a notepad, I took pictures, and even some video throughout my day at the caucus. After stage one of my research, I reflected on my notes and the things that I learned and compiled my report reflecting on any key themes throughout my field research. This ended up being my favorite stage of research, not only because it allowed me to delve into the everyday life of my end users, but also because this was the stage where I felt like I learned the most. The stage dissuaded me from many personal biases that I held against young voters. The next stage of my research was conducting interviews. Considering the exclusion and inclusion criteria, I decided to recruit from UW campus. Keeping in mind what I wanted to learn during my interview process, I selected people within my demographic of interest. One participant who identified as a non-voter, one who identified as a voter, and one participant who was active in politics and has spent a number of years working on political campaigns. For my interviews, I really wanted to dig in and get a lot of information out of my participants. I decided to do a semi-structured format that allowed for open-ended questions so that I could ask more questions if I stumbled upon an interesting topic. This worked really well for me, and I was able to get a lot of good information from my participants, including unearthing one of my key findings. The key findings from this portion of my research surprised me, where my personal biases had led me to believe that a lot of young people are apathetic and lazy in regards to participating in politics. This section unearthed some deep misunderstandings about how our political system works. That made me narrow my eyes at our institutes of education rather than the young voters, forever altering my feelings about the youth demographic and forcing me to throw out my personal biases. The final stage of my research was the survey. I used Google Forms to conduct my survey. This is a medium I was familiar with, having used it for past research. I've used other software like Lime Survey and SurveyMonkey, but I prefer the data visualization I get from Google Forms. Recruitment for this survey was fairly easy. I'm an active figure in many online communities that have a pretty diverse population, so getting a decent number of responses proved not to be a challenge at all. I ended up with 79 participants. Questions needed to be carefully crafted not to include implicit bias. This meant many things. Not asking leading questions, carefully selecting question formats appropriate for the type of information you were trying to extrapolate, and also asking enough questions to verify your hypothesis, while also not asking too many questions to put people off the survey. Because my research revolved heavily around the youth demographic, I wanted to design my survey to compare and contrast information from two demographics, the 18 to 25s and the 25 pluses. This would allow me to better confirm my hypothesis that my findings were true for one age group and not the other. This was accomplished by adding some simple logic into my survey. Then, of course, came the step of analyzing my data, coding qualitative and quantitative responses to find trends and hoping that those trends supported my hypothesis. The final step was to communicate the key findings of my research with evidence from each stage of the process that supported my hypothesis. Then, suggest design recommendations that would help resolve these issues. My three strongest findings through my research were about the lack of personal engagement with social media, fundamental misunderstandings, and lack of education surrounding the U.S. political system, and finally, a lack of representation. My research showed that a lot of campaigns are reaching out to the youth vote via social media. However, these mediums are a somewhat unwelcome avenue to receive information about news and politics. Users who reported that they received most or all of their political news from social media also reported being less engaged in the political process overall. My second finding revealed that although people felt that they had a firm understanding of how our voting system works, this didn't stand up to scrutiny. People who felt as though they had a respectable amount of knowledge in this category could not answer simple questions about voter registration or how caucus delegates are counted. Interestingly, my survey revealed that the youth demographic reported learning about politics at a much later age in life than the 25-plus category. Finally, the notable lack of diversity among candidates was a huge deterrent for young voters. The youth demographic reported at 90% they felt that they were not represented at all by any of the current presidential candidates, a sentiment that was echoed throughout my research, particularly while attending the caucus, where the vast majority of attendees were Caucasian and in their 50s or 60s. Design recommendations for these problems included designing a middle school curriculum aimed at engaging future voters at a younger age, as well as encouraging them to run for office or be part of a campaign. I've learned a lot about user research over this last quarter, but now I think I'm going to go enjoy my summer break.